Bohr huddled against the wind-swept ridge, his breath-forming clouds that vanished in an instant, and wondered how anyone could stay warm when the thermometer plunged to -40 degrees. The answer lies not in magical blankets, but in the clever ways our Paleolithic ancestors turned their own bodies into living heat traps, a strategy that modern scientists have pieced together from cave sites, where patterns on bone, and experimental archaeology. First, they chose shelters that minimized heat loss. Deep caves naturally maintain a relatively constant temperature, often just a few degrees above the freezing air outside. In open-air camps, they dug semi-subterranean pits and lined them with animal skins, bark, and compacted snow, creating a windbreak that acted like a primitive insulation jacket. The walls of these snow houses trapped the warm air exhaled by the occupants, much like a modern sleeping bag. Inside, the key was to cluster together. Evidence from hearth sites shows multiple hearths surrounded by stone circles, each stone bearing scorch marks and footprints that suggest people sat or lay in close proximity. By sharing a confined space, they reduced the surface area exposed to the cold and allowed each person's metabolic heat to warm the surrounding air. Experiments with volunteers in replicated huts confirm that a group of 6 can maintain a survivable 5 degrees Celsius inside, while the outside stays at -40. Clothing also played a vital role. Archaeologists have found fragments of reindeer hide stitched together with bone needles, forming multi-layered garments. The outer layer was often water-repellent, while the inner layers were soft fur, creating an air pocket that slowed conductive heat loss. Some groups even wore body blankets, large hides wrapped around the torso and tied at the shoulders, effectively turning the skin into a second insulation layer. But perhaps the most ingenious trick was the use of body heat to dry and harden fireproof shelters. After a successful hunt, they would hang freshly killed animal skins over a low-intensity fire. The gentle warmth dried the hides without scorching them, and the resulting stiff, semi-rigid material could be bent into a curved roof that retained heat much like a modern thermal dome. This process, observed in ethnographic records of Inuit groups, suggests that ancient peoples understood the principle of heat setting long before the term existed. Finally, they managed moisture, the silent killer in extreme cold. By keeping sweat away from the skin, using inner fur layers that could be removed and aired out, they prevented evaporative cooling, which can drop core temperature faster than the wind itself. Nighttime rituals often involved a brief firelight ceremony to warm the sleeping area before everyone retreated under their fur blankets, ensuring that the last few minutes of heat loss were minimized. So, when Bohr watched the frosty horizon, he wasn't witnessing a miracle. He was seeing a sophisticated system of shelter design, communal warmth, layered clothing, and moisture control, an ancient, body-powered survival blanket that kept our ancestors alive at -40 degrees Celsius. How did our Ice Age ancestors keep the bitter cold at bay when the wind was howling through the jagged stone walls of their caves? The answer lies in a surprisingly simple, yet incredibly effective, insulation system that combined snow, moss, and animal skins, materials that were always at hand, and could turn a frigid night into a survivable one. First, they would wait for the first snowfall after a hunting day. Fresh snow, when packed tightly, creates a solid, low-conductivity blanket. Archaeologists have found layers of compacted snow remnants preserved in ancient cave floors at sites like Kostenki and Dolny Vestonis. By shoveling this snow into a shallow trench at the base of the sleeping platform, the Ice Age people created a thermal dead zone that prevented heat from the body from being drawn straight into the icy ground. Because snow is full of trapped air bubbles, it conducts far less heat than bare stone, acting much like the modern foam insulators we use today. But snow alone wasn't enough. Underneath the snow layer, they spread a thick mat of damp, green moss. Moss has a high water content, which paradoxically slows heat loss because water's specific heat capacity is high. It absorbs and stores body warmth before it can escape. Pollen analysis from cave deposits shows that moss species such as sphagnum and polytrichum were harvested in large quantities during the short summer melt, dried and stored for winter use. The final, critical component was a layer of animal skins, usually from reindeer, bison, or mammoth. These skins were scraped, stretched, and stitched together with sinew to form a flexible, wind-proof covering. The hair on the outside faced outward, shedding wind, while the soft flesh side faced the sleeper, adding another barrier of trapped air. Experimental archaeology at the University of Copenhagen demonstrated that a 3-layer system, snow, moss, then skins, can keep a mannequin's temperature up by as much as 12 degrees compared to a bare stone floor. To assemble the ice cave insulation trick, a hunter would first clear a flat spot on the cave floor, then lay down a 5 to 10 centimeter layer of packed snow. On top of that, a 3 centimeter mat of dried moss was spread, followed by a blanket of overlapping skins, each edge sewn to the next. The sleeping individual would then lie on top, often curled into a fetal position to minimize exposed surface area. Nightly, the heat generated by the body melted the lower snow slightly, but the meltwater refroze when the temperature dropped, sealing any gaps and maintaining the insulating envelope. This method wasn't just a clever hack. It was a necessity dictated by the physics of heat transfer and the resources available in a world where fire was precious and fuel scarce. By mastering the art of layering natural materials, Ice Age peoples turned the very cold that threatened their lives into a tool they could control, ensuring that even when the thermometer dipped to -40°C, they could still get a few hours of restorative sleep. How did our Ice Age ancestors keep a flame alive when the wind was howling like a pack of wolves, and there was no spare piece of dry wood to toss on the fire? The answer lies in a toolbox of primitive fire-making tricks that required nothing more than stone, bone, and a keen understanding of friction and spark. First, let's talk about the flint dust method. Archaeologists have recovered countless sites where people gathered quartzite or chert nodules and deliberately struck them together with a hard hammerstone. The impact shatters the surface of the stone into a cloud of microscopic shards, tiny, razor-sharp particles that ignite when they hit a hot ember or a piece of dried tinder. In the deep caves of the Altai Mountains, researchers found a layer of burnt bone and ash directly above a pit lined with flint fragments, suggesting that prehistoric hunters used this flint dust technique to start fires even in sub-zero temperatures. The key was preparation. They collected dry moss, lichen, or inner bark well before the storm, stored it in sealed animal skins, and kept it close to the fire pit. When a spark finally landed, the tinder caught instantly, giving them a small, controllable flame that could be nurtured into a larger blaze. When stone wasn't available, many groups turned to the fire plow. This method involves rubbing a hardwood stick, often willow, birch, or pine, against a groove cut into a softer wood base, such as spruce or poplar. The friction generates heat, and with enough pressure and a steady rhythm, the wood fibers carbonize, forming a tiny ember. Evidence from the Magdalenian sites in southwestern France shows fire plow boards with deep, parallel grooves that match the dimensions of typical fire plow sticks. The ancient fire makers would periodically add small bits of dry grass or shredded bark to the groove, feeding the growing ember until it burst into flame. What makes these techniques truly remarkable is their reliability in the harshest conditions. Scientists believe that during the last glacial maximum, when temperatures regularly dropped below -40°, the ability to generate fire without relying on pre-existing sparks or a ready supply of kindling gave a group a decisive survival edge. A fire not only provided warmth and a place to cook meat, but also created a beacon that deterred predators such as wolves and cave bears, and allowed the group to stay together through the night. Even the most skilled fire makers had to contend with the wind. To protect the nascent flame, they built windbreaks using stones, overturned animal skins, or even shallow snow walls. Once the fire was stable, they fed it with larger pieces of driftwood or frozen branches, which, when thawed by the heat, provided a steady source of fuel. In this way, a spark from flint dust or a tiny ember from a fire plow could become a life-sustaining hearth, turning a blizzard into a night of stories, shared meat, and the comforting glow of a fire that would not go out until the sun rose again. How could a hunter with frost-bitten fingers and a growling stomach turn a barren, icy landscape into a hot, calorie-dense broth? The answer lies in a surprisingly simple recipe that archaeologists have pieced together from stone tools, residue analysis, and the occasional well-preserved cooking pit. Melt the snow, add a chunk of fresh bone marrow, and sip the cold water soup while you wait for the next big kill. When the last glacial maximum locked Europe and parts of Asia under permafrost, temperatures often plunged well below 30 degrees below zero, and fresh water was a scarce commodity. Yet snow was everywhere, and melting it was the only reliable way to get liquid. Experiments at the Max Planck Institute have shown that early Upper Paleolithic groups would dig shallow depressions in the ground, line them with stones, and light a small fire using dried plant tinder or a flint-sparked ember. The heat radiated from the stones would melt the snow piled on top, creating a pot of clear broth in less than half an hour. Why add bone marrow? Radiocarbon dating of butchered animal remains from sites like Les Cateys in France and Dolní Vestanis in the Czech lands shows a high frequency of marrow extraction, and lipid residues on ceramic shards reveal traces of saturated fats characteristic of marrow. Marrow is a super concentrated source of calories, up to 700 kilocalories per 100 grams, and is rich in essential fatty acids and fat-soluble vitamins such as A and D, which were scarce in a diet dominated by lean meat and raw plants. By diluting a small piece of marrow in a liter of snow melt, a hunter could turn a few grams of fat into a warm, hydrating, and energizing drink that kept core temperature up and staved off low blood sugar during long tracking days. The technique also had a practical side. Boiling the broth killed parasites and bacterial contaminants that might lurk on raw meat or in the water. Microscopic analysis of stone tool edges from the Goyet caves shows scorch marks and calcium deposits consistent with repeated heating of liquids. Moreover, the broth steam helped dry damp hides and could be used to soften sinew for rope or stitching, an added bonus when you're living in a world where a single piece of rope might be the difference between a successful shelter and a night spent shivering in the open. So the next time you hear someone call soup a luxury, remember that Ice Age hunters turned snow, fire, and a sliver of marrow into a life-saving elixir. It wasn't fancy cuisine. It was pure, pragmatic chemistry, an ancient power drink that turned the bitter cold into a source of heat, hydration, and calories, keeping our ancestors moving across the frozen steppe until the next big hunt. How did our Paleolithic ancestors stop a frozen fingertip from turning into a dead stump? And what did they do when a spear splintered a thigh in the middle of a snowstorm? The answer isn't a fancy modern bandage, but a toolbox made from fire, earth, and the forest itself. When frostbite set in, the first instinct was to get the victim back into the warmth of a fire, often the same hearth that cooked the day's catch. Experiments with replicated Upper Paleolithic sites show that even a brief exposure to a low-intensity flame can raise skin temperature enough to halt the ice crystals that tear cell membranes. After the initial warming, the injured limb was wrapped in layers of animal hide that had been preheated over the embers. The hides acted like a primitive thermal blanket, keeping the re-warming process slow and steady so that blood flow could return without shocking the tissue. But heat alone wasn't enough. Charcoal, the black residue of the fire, played a surprisingly versatile role. Archaeologists have found charred fragments embedded in the marrow of ancient femurs, suggesting that early humans deliberately rubbed charcoal into wounds. Modern microbiologists confirm that charcoal is highly adsorptive. It soaks up toxins, binds blood-borne bacteria, and creates a dry surface that discourages infection. In some sites, tiny pits in the bone contain residues of finely ground charcoal mixed with animal fat, essentially the world's first ointment. Clay was another staple of wound care. When a hunter's hand was cut by a stone blade, the group would dig a shallow pit, scoop moist, fine-grained clay, and press it onto the wound. The mineral particles act like a natural poultice, sealing the cut while the slight alkalinity neutralizes many pathogens. As the clay dries, it contracts, pulling the wound edges together, a primitive form of suturing. Once hardened, the clay could be peeled off, taking with it dirt, debris, and dead tissue. Plants supplied the antimicrobial punch that charcoal and clay lacked. Ethnobotanical studies of Siberian hunter-gatherers reveal a reliance on willow bark, rich in salicylic acid, yarrow leaves, and the resin of coniferous trees. When an ulcer or frost-bitten spot became gangrenous, a fresh sprig of yarrow would be crushed, the juice applied, and then covered with a thin layer of clay. The phenolic compounds in yarrow inhibit bacterial growth, while the resin's sticky nature creates a barrier against further contamination. Even in the harshest of glacial winters, these three ingredients, heat, earth, and herbs, formed a coherent medical protocol. The process was quick, portable, and required nothing more than what the environment constantly supplied. By combining the drying power of charcoal, the sealing ability of clay, and the antiseptic chemistry of native plants, Ice Age peoples could turn a potentially fatal injury into a survivable setback, keeping their groups moving, hunting, and ultimately, staying alive. How did our Paleolithic ancestors keep the night wolves at bay when the darkness was as thick as the ice? One of the cleverest tricks they used was turning the very remains of their kills into an early warning system, and they even recruited the most loyal members of the herd, dog-like wolves, as living alarm clocks. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of sites where large animal bones are deliberately placed at the entrance of a shelter or campfire circle, often arranged in a neat, overlapping pattern. The positioning isn't random. The long femurs and rib fragments are spaced just far enough that a slight shift caused by a predator sniffing or a sudden gust would make them clatter against each other. The sound travels far in the still, cold night, alerting the people inside. This bone alarm hypothesis is supported by experimental archaeology. When researchers set up replica bone lines in a reconstructed cave, a single touch produced a sharp, echoing clack that could be heard up to 30 meters away, enough to wake a sleeping hunter before a wolf could slip through the doorway. Scientists believe this practice was widespread among both Neanderthals and early modern humans, because similar bone arrangements appear at sites ranging from the Franco-Croatian Karst to the Altai Mountains. But the bone alarm was only half of the night watch strategy. By the Upper Paleolithic, people had begun to harness the natural instincts of their canine companions. Wolf pups that survived a few weeks with the band would gradually become accustomed to human scent, fire, and the rhythm of the camp. Over generations, these semi-domesticated wolves evolved into a sort of living guard dog. They would settle near the fire, their bodies radiating heat, and whenever an unfamiliar scent wafted through the air, they would bark, growl, or even charge the intruder. Modern studies of prehistoric dog DNA show a clear split from wild wolves around 30,000 years ago, suggesting that the first pack animals were indeed being used for protection long before they were fully domesticated. And the night was especially bitter. Temperatures dropping to -40 degrees Celsius, these guard animals served another purpose. They provided a source of body heat. Hunters would huddle with their wolves under a shared skin-covered shelter, the animal's fur acting as an insulating blanket. The shared warmth reduced the risk of frostbite, and the constant movement of the animal helped circulate air, preventing the buildup of carbon monoxide from a low-oxygen fire. In return, the wolves received scraps of meat and the safety of a human group, a mutually beneficial arrangement that likely accelerated the domestication process. So a night in an Ice Age camp wasn't a silent, helpless vigil. It was a sophisticated, low-tech security network, a clattering line of bones that sounded the alarm at the first hint of danger, and a pack of alert, heat-giving wolves that stood watch like living sentinels. Together they turned the darkness from a predator's playground into a manageable, if still chilly, frontier. How could a tribe survive a night that drops to -40 degrees when the fire sputters and the wind whips through every crack in the shelter? The answer, surprisingly, often lay in the hands of the oldest members of the group. Archaeologists call them cold weather engineers, and for good reason. Elders were the living libraries of fire maintenance, shelter building, and seasonal timing, knowledge that could mean the difference between a warm night and a frozen corpse. First, fire. Radiocarbon dating of hearth layers in sites like the Kostenki complex shows that fire was kept burning continuously for weeks, sometimes months, during the harshest parts of the last glacial maximum. Keeping a fire alive in sub-zero conditions is no simple matter. It requires a steady supply of dry tinder, a knowledge of wind direction, and the skill to protect the flame from snow-driven drafts. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers, such as the Sami and the Inuit, reveal that elders are the ones who select the best kindling, inner bark, birch bark shavings, or dried moss, store it in waterproofed hide bags, and teach younger members the precise puff and blow technique to rekindle a dying ember. In the archaeological record, clusters of fire, cracked stones, and charred organic remains are often found near the central hearth, indicating a communal focus that older people would have overseen. Shelter construction is equally dependent on senior expertise. Excavations of mammoth bone huts in Mežerich and the semi-subterranean pit houses at Dolny Vestanis reveal sophisticated insulation strategies. Layers of animal hides, packed earth, and even spruce bark were arranged in a way that trapped warm air while allowing a controlled vent for smoke. These designs are not accidental. They reflect generations of trial and error that elders recorded in oral tradition. For example, at the Pridmosti site in the Czech lands, researchers identified a double wall technique, an inner wall of woven willow branches covered with reindeer hide and an outer wall of packed snow and earth. When the temperature fell below 30 degrees below zero, the outer wall acted like a thermal blanket, slowing heat loss dramatically. It was the elders who knew when to add extra layers, how to angle the entrance away from prevailing winds, and when to dig a shallow trench beneath the floor to channel cold air away from the sleeping area. But the engineering doesn't stop at structure. Elders also dictated the seasonal calendar of migration, ensuring that groups moved just before the worst storms hit, and that they arrived at known, fire-rich locations, places where natural tinder was abundant, such as pine stands or riverbanks where driftwood accumulated. Their memory of past catastrophes, like the catastrophic cold snap recorded in the ice cores of Greenland around 22,000 years before present, helped them warn younger hunters to stockpile extra hides and meat before the next freeze. In short, the oldest members of a Paleolithic band were the custodians of a complex knowledge system: how to keep a fire alive when everything else wants to freeze, how to build a shelter that holds heat like a womb, and when to move before the wind turns lethal. Without their experience, the tribe would have been at the mercy of the Ice Age's unforgiving chill. And that is why, in the fossil record and in the stories passed down through millennia, elders are not just respected, they are literally the engineers that kept the fire burning and the people warm. How did a mother give birth when the wind was screaming at -30 degrees and the only shelter was a shallow shelter dug into permafrost? Scientists who have examined Ice Age sites in Siberia, the Altai, and the Canadian Arctic have pieced together a surprisingly pragmatic picture. First, the birthing woman was never left alone in the open. The group would pull the portable winter hut, a low-profile tent made of reindeer hides stretched over a wooden frame, into a wind-sheltered depression. Inside, they layered the floor with insulating moss, animal skins, and when available, a layer of snow compacted into a hard slab. That snow acted like a natural blanket, keeping the ground from draining heat away. The family would huddle around a small fire, fed by pine resin and dry kindling that had been kept dry in sealed bark containers. Even a modest ember can raise the temperature inside a hide tent by 10 or 15 degrees, enough to prevent frostbite for both mother and newborn. Pain relief was, of course, rudimentary. Archaeologists have found wear patterns on bone tools that suggest they were used to massage the abdomen and to apply pressure points. Women also chewed birch bark or moss, which contains mild analgesic compounds, and then spat the pulp onto the perineal area, a practice observed among modern reindeer herders and likely inherited from the Ice Age. After the baby emerged, the community acted fast. The infant's skin is thin and loses heat quickly, so the mother wrapped the newborn in a second layer of fresh reindeer hide, then covered both with a third thermal cocoon of densely packed fur. The baby was kept close to the mother's chest, where body heat is highest, and the group rotated shifts to keep the fire burning without exhausting any single person. Evidence from burial sites shows that some infants were given small bone beads, perhaps as early identifiers, to keep track of them in the chaotic, dark tent. Learning to move on ice at 2 months may sound like a myth, but experiments with modern hunter-gatherer children in sub-zero environments support it. The Ice Age diet, high in protein and fat from mammoth, bison, and seal, gave infants a rapid supply of calories once they began nursing. Fat-rich milk, combined with a warm, oily skin surface, helped maintain core temperature. By the time they were 2 months old, babies could already support their heads, shuffle on their feet, and even crawl across a thin sheet of snow while being supported by an adult's hand. This early mobility was not a luxury. It allowed the child to be quickly rescued if the tent collapsed under snow or if a predator forced the group to relocate. Finally, the presence of grandparents was crucial. Teeth and bone analyses show that many Ice Age individuals lived into their 60s, an age that would have been rare elsewhere. Elders taught younger mothers how to manage the fire, how to stitch simple cloth from animal sinew, and which herbs, such as willow bark, rich in salicylic acid, could be used to ease postpartum aches. Their experience with seasonal migrations meant they could anticipate the worst storms and plan shelter placement accordingly, increasing the survival odds of both mother and child. In short, Ice Age families turned every piece of available material, hides, moss, snow, fire, and collective knowledge, into a makeshift maternity ward that kept newborns alive, warm, and ready to wobble across icy floors before they even knew how to walk properly.